I would like to take my visit here today as an opportunity to thank you all for the tireless work you do to keep our country safe.
King Charles's arrival at MI5 Headquarters was anything but routine. With a convoy of blacked-out vehicles and an air of urgency, the monarch stepped into Britain's top intelligence hub, only to be met with something that left even him speechless. Whispers of classified operations, a brewing scandal, or a betrayal at the highest levels. What did he uncover? As royal protocol clashed with deep state secrecy, those present knew this moment could change everything. The question is, what shocking truth awaited King Charles behind those heavily guarded doors? King Charles walks into MI5 Headquarters. London, a crisp autumn evening. The air carried a sharp bite, the kind that settled deep in the bones. But inside the headquarters of MI5, the atmosphere was even colder. Agents moved swiftly through the corridors, files in hand, whispers of classified missions floating through the air. But then, without warning, the heavy double doors swung open. A figure stepped inside his presence alone, as enough to halt the room mid-motion. King Charles III. There was no grand entrance, no pre-announced visit, no royal entourage flanking him. He stood alone, his posture upright, his expression unreadable. Silence stretched through the room like a taut wire, the weight of his presence demanding attention. Agents exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to bow or speak. Finally, a voice broke the stillness. "Your Majesty, to what do we owe the honor?" Charles stepped forward, scanning the room. "I need to find a man who saved my life. His name erased from every record. I won't leave until I know the truth." A ripple of unease spread through the agents. A forgotten hero? MI5's records were exhaustive. Nothing vanished without a trace. Yet Charles was certain. Director James Caldwell, who had served under 3 prime ministers and witnessed classified operations, stepped forward, troubled by the situation. "Your Majesty, an agent saved your life? Please, tell me more." Charles exhaled slowly, the memory creeping back like a ghost from the past. "It was 1980, he began, his voice steady but distant. I was still the Prince of Wales then, young, eager, unaware of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. That night I had just left a diplomatic function in Edinburgh, making my way back to Balmoral. I believed I was alone. I was wrong." The room was still, each agent hanging on his words. Charles's eyes darkened, staring at a past only he could see. I had taken a quieter route to avoid the press. An old habit. The road was deserted, a thick mist rolling over the Scottish Highlands. But as I approached a secluded stretch, headlights flared in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another car. Then, it accelerated. Within seconds, the vehicle swerved sharply in front of me, forcing me to a screeching stop. Before I could react, 3 men stepped out, armed. A collective tension filled the room. A royal ambush? A story never heard before? "They surrounded my car," Charles continued. One of them tapped the window with the barrel of his gun, his message clear: "Step out or they would drag me out." My heart pounded, but before I could even move, a voice cut through the darkness. Sharp, commanding, unshaken. "Let him go, now." Charles's jaw tightened, reliving the moment as though it had just happened. A figure emerged from the shadows. Alone. He wasn't dressed like the police. No official uniform. But the way he carried himself, he was trained. He had been waiting for them, watching. The men hesitated for just a second too long, and that's when he struck. A breathless pause hung in the air. A gunshot rang out. One of the attackers staggered back, his weapon clattering to the ground. Before the others could react, my protector was on them. He moved fast, too fast. A flurry of strikes, precise, efficient. One by one, they fell. Charles looked up, his gaze piercing. He fought like a man who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. By the time I found my bearings, 2 of the men were unconscious. The 3rd had fled. My rescuer, wounded but unwavering, turned to me. "Go. Now." Caldwell's voice was low, almost hesitant. "Did he tell you his name, Your Majesty?" Charles shook his head slowly. I asked. He simply said, "You were never meant to know." And then he disappeared into the night. The next day, I tried to find him. I called every security branch and every intelligence officer I knew. But there was nothing. No record, no trace. It was as if he never existed. The silence in the room was thick. MI5 prided itself on knowing everything, and yet an unknown agent had single-handedly saved the future King of England and vanished. "So you see," Charles said, his voice laced with resolve, "I cannot accept that. I owe him my life, and I will not stop until I know who he was." The weight of his words settled over the room. A challenge, a command. An unknown agent saved the future King of England, then vanished without a trace. Who was he and why didn't he want to be found? Stay tuned, dead-end search. Director James Caldwell stood still, his gaze sweeping the room. The tension was thick as agents waited, fingers hovering over keyboards. He turned to the man across from him. "Sir, are you sure? Even the smallest detail could help." King Charles frowned, his mind racing. "A scar. A long one across his left hand. I saw it when he pulled me to run." Before he disappeared, he said, "Blackhawk." Silence filled the room. A few agents exchanged wary looks. Caldwell crossed his arms, voice lowered. "Blackhawk isn't just a name. It's a ghost story. In 20 years with MI5, I've only heard it whispered once." Charles frowned, his gaze fixed on the scrolling data. "That man saved my life, Director. And yet you're telling me he's a ghost? Someone, somewhere, erased him from history. But why? And more importantly, who?" Caldwell exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Your Majesty, there are levels of secrecy even within MI5. Shadow 1, if he was ever real, was buried for a reason. And digging him up could mean uncovering something the world was never meant to see." The room fell silent. Then a sudden alert blared across the command center. One of the younger analysts gasped. "Sir, I think I found something. A deeply encrypted file hidden in an abandoned server. It's old, classified beyond our current clearance, but it bears the same phrase. Blackhawk." Caldwell leaned in. "Decrypt it, now." As the agent worked, the screen flickered with lines of distorted text before stabilizing. The first word sent a chill through the room. Blackhawk. Terminated. March 17, 1984. Unauthorized disclosure is punishable by treason. King Charles took a step closer, reading the words carefully. Terminated? Does that mean he's dead? Or was he simply removed? Caldwell remained silent. Something about this didn't add up. "Your Majesty, I must advise caution. Whoever buried this file wanted it to stay buried. If we keep pushing, we may be knocking on a door that should remain closed." Charles straightened, his voice unwavering. "That man risked his life for me. I need to know what happened to him, no matter the cost." The agents exchanged uneasy glances. The search for Blackhawk was no longer just about uncovering a man's past. It was about unearthing secrets that could change everything. The Blackhawk's return. King Charles's search for the truth. Caldwell hesitated briefly, then turned toward an agent standing in the corner. "Find William Jones. He was deep in covert operations before retiring in 1997. If anyone remembers Blackhawk, it's him." An hour later, King Charles and Caldwell were inside a reinforced SUV, cruising through a quiet suburb of London. The houses were modest, the streets nearly empty. William Jones had once been a giant in the intelligence community, a man whose name carried weight in the darkest corridors of power. Now, he was just another recluse, tucked away in a weathered house with an overgrown yard. Caldwell stepped out first, rapping on the door. No response. Charles studied the house, faded paint, worn shingles, but the windows had reinforced locks. A man like Jones wouldn't live without security. Caldwell knocked harder. "William, open up. We need to talk." A deep, gravelly voice responded from within. "Go away. I don't have anything to do with you people anymore." Charles stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about you. It's about a man who disappeared. A Secret Service agent once known as Blackhawk." Silence. Then, a soft click. The door creaked open just enough to reveal William Jones. He was older now, well into his 60s, but his sharp gaze was that of a man who had spent his life navigating dangerous ground. Beneath the steel in his eyes was something else, something darker. Jones folded his arms, his voice lined with suspicion. "If you're asking about Blackhawk, then you're either incredibly reckless, or you have no idea what you're getting into." Caldwell met his gaze, unwavering. "Tell us the truth." Jones exhaled heavily, then stepped aside, motioning them in. The living room was small, the air thick with the scent of old books and dust. Faded photographs lined the walls, snapshots of a past no longer spoken of. Charles let his eyes roam until they landed on one particular image, a group of agents, dressed in black, standing in rigid formation. But one man stood slightly apart, his gaze not fixed on the camera like the others. Charles pointed. "Is that him?" Jones stared at the photo for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, but his name wasn't always Blackhawk. He had a real name once. Not that anyone remembers it now." Caldwell spoke, her voice measured. "We need to find him." Hayes looked at Charles, his expression unreadable. "If you're serious about this, understand one thing. There's a reason he disappeared. And if you go looking, there are people who will do whatever it takes to keep the truth buried." Charles didn't blink. "I owe him my life. No matter who I have to face, I won't stop. Who is the mysterious man known only as Blackhawk? And why is everyone desperate to keep his past a secret? Stay tuned to uncover the truth." The photograph in the envelope. The silence in the dimly lit living room stretched as King Charles watched the aging intelligence officer. Jones exhaled deeply before disappearing into another room. When he returned, he carried a tattered envelope encased in protective plastic. He set it down on the polished oak table between them. "This is all I have left of him," Jones murmured, his voice weighed with something unspoken. "But be careful, Your Majesty. Some debts can't be repaid without a cost." King Charles hesitated before picking up the envelope. It felt heavier than expected, as if burdened by the secrets it contained. He peeled back the plastic, revealing a faded photograph and a heavily classified MI5 dossier, still stamped with the government's official seal. The secrets of one of the most enigmatic operatives in the kingdom's history were about to unravel. But for every answer, new mysteries loomed. He lifted the photograph, its edges worn from time. The image captured a gathering of MI5 operatives, their suits crisp, their expressions impassive. But one figure stood apart. A man in a dark suit, standing slightly behind the others, not looking at the camera, but watching something beyond the frame. His sharp eyes held an intensity as if anticipating a danger no one else could see. Below the photograph, a faint inscription read, "Don Henry, MI5 Special Operations." King Charles turned the photograph toward Jones, his voice measured. "Is this him?" Jones nodded, his gaze distant, as if looking back through the decades. "Don Henry, the best operative I ever knew. But he wasn't just another agent." Charles frowned. Jones took a slow breath, his fingers tightening against the table's edge. Don wasn't simply working for MI5. He was embedded deep within the most dangerous criminal networks Britain had ever seen. He uncovered government dealings with underground syndicates, exposed corruption at the highest levels, and took on missions that no one else dared to touch. King Charles tightened his grip on the photograph. That's why he was erased. Jones gave a slow nod. No one wanted a man like Don Henry to exist. His name was systematically removed from every record, every database. Officially, he was never even born. If he's still alive, why has no one been able to find him? Jones met his gaze. Because he doesn't want to be found. Or worse, someone ensured he never would be. The living room fell into silence. Then King Charles rose from his chair, his resolve solidifying. "We're going to find him." Jones let out a long breath. "If you're serious, I have a lead, but it won't be safe." King Charles didn't hesitate. "That's not a concern." 3 days later, Charles and Caldwell arrived at a remote countryside estate on the outskirts of Northumberland. The night air was razor-sharp, the wind whispering through the barren trees as they followed a gravel road leading into a dense woodland. Tucked away in the shadows stood a lone stone cottage, its chimney releasing a thin curl of smoke into the cold air. Caldwell instinctively reached for the firearm beneath his coat before signaling Charles to hold back. "We don't know who's inside. Let me go first." Charles shook his head. "I'll handle it." They approached the heavy wooden door. Caldwell rapped his knuckles against it, 3 firm knocks echoing in the stillness. No response. Then, after a pause, Charles stepped forward and spoke with quiet authority. "Don Henry, I know you're in there." For a moment, there was nothing but the wind rustling through the trees. Then, a faint click. The door creaked open just slightly, revealing a pair of shadowed, weary eyes peering through the dim interior. Don Henry. His face was sharper now, his once pristine features weathered by time. His hair, now streaked with silver, framed a face that had seen too much. But his eyes, those same calculating, battle-worn eyes, remained unchanged. Charles met his gaze, unwavering. "I've been looking for you for 40 years." Don stood motionless, the weight of the past pressing against the present. Then, at last, he pushed the door open wider. "If you've come this far," he murmured, his voice carrying the remnants of old secrets, "then you must truly want answers. The secrets that should never be found." Inside the dimly lit cabin, shadows stretched across the walls cast by the flickering glow of an old oil lamp. Stacks of yellowed newspapers covered the table, their faded headlines whispering of past political scandals. King Charles recognized many names among them, but the details, the ones that had never been made public, left a chill running down his spine. Don Henry sat across from him, his piercing gaze locked onto Charles. His voice was calm, but laced with the weight of years spent in hiding. "I saved you that night because if you died, the truth would have died with you. But I never expected you'd be the one to come looking for me." Charles's jaw tightened. "Why did you disappear?" Don let out a dry, bitter chuckle. "Because I had evidence no one wanted to exist. The kind that could bring down entire institutions. When I was ready to expose it, they made sure I vanished. A staged attack. A secret arrest warrant. By morning, I no longer existed." Charles's voice was steady. "I can't change the past, but I can set things right." Don's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you think you can do?" Charles rose from his seat, his determination unshaken. "I will make sure your name is restored. The world will know what happened." Don shook his head. "You don't get it. The people who did this, they still have power. If you expose the truth, you won't just be risking me. You'll be risking yourself." Charles didn't hesitate. "I'm not afraid." Don exhaled, then retrieved a metal box from an old cabinet and placed it on the table. "If you're serious, you need to see the truth." Charles unlocked it, revealing classified documents, photos, and recordings, proof of a decades-old cover-up. James Caldwell skimmed the files, his face hardening. "If this is real, it changes everything." Don eyed Charles with a faint smile. "You never know when to quit." Charles met his gaze. "Men like you don't deserve to be forgotten." Don closed the box. "Once this gets out, there's no turning back." Charles didn't flinch. "I never back down." Don nodded. "All right, let's do this." What's the truth about Don's hiding, and what price will Charles pay to expose it? Stay tuned to uncover the secrets that could change everything. The truth unveiled. The world had forgotten Don Henry. For 4 decades, his name had been erased, his service buried, and his sacrifices left unacknowledged. But that was about to change. Standing before a sea of flashing cameras, King Charles took a steady breath. The air was thick with expectation, journalists waiting for a revelation they never saw coming. But this wasn't about him. It was about a man who had given everything and received nothing in return. "Today," Charles began, his voice clear and unwavering, "we correct a grave injustice." He turned to the man beside him. Don Henry, once a proud and decorated agent, had lived in exile for 40 years. The weight of lost time sat heavy on his shoulders, but in his eyes, there was something unbreakable: resolve. Charles continued, "Don Henry stood against corruption, risking everything to expose the truth. But those in power silenced him. They tried to erase him. They failed." The room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on every witness. For too long, a hero was forced to live in the shadows. That ends today. Don's breath hitched as Charles reached into his pocket and unfolded a document, the royal seal gleaming under the lights. It was official. His honor was restored. The following morning, history was rewritten. A special proclamation reinstated Don's name in the records, and his service was acknowledged at the highest level. Days later, at a formal ceremony, he received one of the highest honors, a recognition long overdue. The once forgotten agent stood tall as the room erupted into applause. But Charles knew this was more than just about one man. A week later, the Don Henry Foundation was established, ensuring that those who had given everything in silence would finally be remembered. Their sacrifices would not be forgotten. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Don stood by his window, watching the light fade. For the first time in decades, he felt seen. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Thank you for remembering me." Charles met his gaze and nodded. "Men like you should never be forgotten." And with that, he turned and walked away, knowing the truth had finally come to light. What if justice only exists when someone dares to fight for it? Will you help keep these stories alive? Like, share and subscribe, because one retold story could change everything.